We open to what looks like a turn-of-the-century town, and we must be in Ireland because there's a softly lilting flute in the music, like what all TV introductions to Ireland have. We're probably on the holodeck too, as that looks a lot like Tom Paris, and he's sporting the Starfleet sideburn. He's accosted by the stereotype of a local ne'er-do-well to whom he gives some money. Understandable that Paris would have a soft spot for screw-ups. The town and its occupants are the latest holodeck creation of Paris, and one in which Kim and the Doc are also indulging. As a pastiche of Ireland born of Paris's mind, naturally the centre of attention is Sullivan's, the local pub. Paris is running a gambling ring, of course, but at least it's for fake money this time rather than replicator rations, so we'll count that as progress, of a sort. Janeway arrives to see what all the fuss is about, as Fairhaven has become quite popular among the crew. She's also come to piss on their fun, as they're approaching a Class 9 Wibbly and she needs them at work. Sounds important, but not so important that Janeway can't make eyes at the holographic bartender before leaving. The Class 9 Wibbly is serious stuff. Seven thinks it's from two neutron stars having a bit of a cuddle, and the resulting shockwave is both serious and swift. It's also bollocksed up our warp engines, so we can't leg it until it's passed. The Doc will dose everyone up so it doesn't kill us, and we'll have to ride it out. Janeway's in the mess hall reminiscing, this current Wibbly reminding her of storms from her childhood in Indiana. Neelix says they had some spectacular storms on Talax too, which is an odd thing to mention when he was raised on the moon of Rhinax. Maybe he saw some while he was there, dodging the draft, before he left the system when his home got kaboomed. He's also worried about morale over the next few days, and thinks keeping the holodeck running will give people a chance to take their minds off things. After all, a very serious science Wibbly washing over a piece of tech most notable for how regularly it fucks up can't possibly cause any problems. Jesus Christ on a penny farthing, how are any of you twats still alive? This whole crew has the self-preservation skills of a fucking Mars bar. Janeway agrees anyway, though her decision may not have been entirely impartial, based on her going back to chat with the bartender she briefly spoke to and had a little stare at before. He feels important, so let's make him ours with a new name. Through the wheel's ineffable mysteries, we bestow upon him the name of... Mr. Punter, suggested by Lieutenant Tristan Daly. He's friendly at her return and serves her tea, despite him closing up for the night from the looks of things. They get on very well, something that causes Janeway to reconsider being here and make her excuses. He tries to convince her to stay by challenging her to a game. Leaving would be losing, so she agrees to just one. One becomes more, becomes arm wrestling, becomes talking while getting wankered on whiskey. Janeway and Mr. Punter are getting on well again, a situation somewhat impacted by the arrival of Mrs. Punter. Janeway makes her excuses and departs, perhaps to check her weapon collection for something that'll work on holographic wives. That Wibbly is nearly upon us, and the Doc is giving everyone those shots. Janeway arrives for hers, and if her discovery of Mrs. Punter caused upset, then she's doing a good job of hiding it. She's even fine with Paris expanding the program to take up their second holodeck. Maybe she thinks that'll give her somewhere to bury the body. Up to the bridge we go, just in time for that Wibbly to hit us. There are some minor kabooms, but we get those whenever someone farts, so I wouldn't worry about it. It's a similar story all over the ship, minor stuff that we can repair without too much bother. Now the leading edge of the storm is past us, all we have to do is wait a few days. Everybody's using the downtime to see Fairhaven, and it looks like Janeway plans to do the same. Just as soon as she's had a chance to make one or two tweaks to a character, anyway, and delete his wife. While she's committing holomurder, Tuvok's having a rough time of things in the mess hall. I seem to recall the Doc giving a line about seeing him immediately if there was any dizziness, so perhaps this is connected to the Wibbly we're in. He tries to decline a suggestion by Seven to visit the Doc, but the rest of the crew have other plans. Either they've noticed he's unwell and want to be dicks about it, or he's just having terrible luck, as both Kim and Paris, and then Neelix, manage to make his nausea worse. In the face of their onslaught, Tuvok surrenders and visits the doctor. To the holodeck again. Janeway's getting into the mood this time and has come dressed accordingly. Rather than the pub, she finds Mr. Punter on a bench at the train station, where he swapped games and arm wrestling for poetry and quiet contemplation. Chatting ensues, and they eventually decide to go on a little walk together, with some less than subtle flirting from him. A bit awkward then that Chakotay chooses now to show up. He's invited by Mr. Punter to join them, but knows well enough when he'd be a third wheel and leaves them to it. Whatever it is. A little later, we're getting an update on the Wibbly. Expectations that we were over the worst prove unfounded, as Seven's found a load more unpleasantness at the arse end of it. That would explain Tuvok's nausea, he says, as Vulcans are sensitive to the type of science bollocks that this Wibbly is throwing out. I wonder if he'll go off like a sprinkler when the worst of it comes. Chakotay notices Janeway's been reading Irish poetry and can't help but have a little jab at her about a certain Mr. Punter. It's all in good spirits, though, and he thinks she should have some fun with it rather than be embarrassed. Maybe this was the push she needed, as she's back in Fairhaven later and dancing with Mr. Punter. Based on their interactions once it's over, their next dance may be horizontal. In Janeway's quarters, she's recycling her books of Irish poetry with an air of finality about her. If there's any doubt that things didn't go quite the way she planned with Mr. Punter, it's dispelled by the arrival of Neelix. He invites her to a gathering at Fairhaven, and she declines in favour of work. Whatever happened, it's not just affecting her. Neelix is acting as bar rodent, because the guy normally in charge of it, Mr. Punter, is more interested in getting completely shit-faced. She's left him, you see, gone when he woke up from a nap after spending the day together. They're not sure who he means to begin with until he explains that he's talking about their friend. Paris tries to defuse the situation, an attempt that ends up with Mr. Punter attacking him and the rest of the pub crowd piling in too for the giggles. Even the people he made think that he's a dick. Things get even more out of hand, and we retire to sickbay so we can patch up those affected. Janeway arrives and wants to know what started all the fun, an explanation the crew find difficult to share with her. The Doc steps in and suggests that maybe she and he should go for a little walk. He explains the situation, namely that Mr. Punter got wankered, kicked off a fight, climbed a tree, and then started shouting for her. That's not the sort of response you get from some meaningless dalliance, and while Mr. Punter can be reprogrammed to not care, he's concerned the same approach cannot be applied to Janeway. She admits she's become involved with him. How could she not? She literally made her perfect man. Well, mostly. The sleep during which she disappeared revealed that he snores. As she was about to delete that from his program, she realized the whole thing was an illusion and legged it. She considered leaving him a note, but decided against it, suggesting it would have been foolish to do so for a hologram, which is a bit fucking insensitive when you consider who she's talking to. The Doc points out that there's no functional difference between biological and photonic, something he's been trying to argue for over 5 years now. In fact, this option is the only viable solution for her. She can't bang the crew because she's their boss. I mean, she's technically done that twice now, and had kids with one of them to boot, but those were somewhat extreme circumstances, so we'll ignore them. If all the crew are ruled out, then who else has she got for however long this trip will last? Someone on the holodeck may be the only long-term option. More than that, he thinks the problem isn't that Mr. Punter's a hologram, but that she's treating him as one. Being able to alter aspects of him on a whim is, in the Doc's opinion, what's making her consider him as just a simulation. Someone you can change by toggling a variable isn't a partner, it's a toy. The arse end of the Wibbly is here, and it's not messing about. Things go a bit kaboomy and we start to get dragged along by it. Chakotay thinks we can do a science that'll part the waves for us, but it's going to take power. Lots of power. All of the power, in fact, including the power from the holodecks. Of course, we established in the very first season of the show that the dedicated holodeck power generators were completely incompatible with everything else on Voyager, but let's ignore that for now. If we pull everything, it might be enough, but the Fairhaven simulation is still running. Fuck knows why, as I'm pretty sure that this storm, which we've known is coming for a good couple of days by the way, constitutes an all-hands situation, so the holodeck must be empty, but let's ignore that too. Taking power from the holodeck without shutting it down will probably bugger up the program, but we don't really have a choice. The science works and Voyager manages to escape the Wibbly. Not all escapes are born equal though, and Fairhaven has paid the price for ours. The technical term is shit's fucked, and they can only save small portions of the program. Ne'er-do-well stereotype survives long enough for a chat, of course, because we need to shoehorn in another bit of begging, then he fades out, leaving Paris and Kim unsure what else to save. Paris knows who should get the first choice, though. He sees Janeway and lets her know how bad things are. He thinks the program can be rebuilt in a month or two, but wants to know if there are any things in particular from this version that she'd like to save. Mr. Punter has been safely squirreled away, and the computer tells Janeway that he's uncorrupted. She brings him online and they have an awkward conversation where she can't fully explain to him the reason for her leaving. She's going away again now, too, she says, but maybe she'll be back in a month or two. After she ends the program, she makes one final change by removing her ability to alter him before we fly away. Before we go into the summary, we're going to have a rant about a throwaway comment from Janeway. She says the harp on the sign is the wrong way round. Now, I've popped over to Dublin a few times, and I'm partial to a certain variety of stout every now and again, and that comment struck me as wrong. Naturally, because I've got a spicy brain, this led to a delightful multi-hour rabbit hole of research, and if I've got to put up with that shit, then frankly, so do you. Settle in, folks, 'cause we're bringing out the sign. The right-facing harp, which is to say that the soundboard where the player sits is on the left, has been used by the Guinness Company since 1862, and formally registered as a trademark of theirs since 1876. The harp is also known, now, as an official symbol of the Irish government, but that didn't happen until 1922, due in no small part to there not being an Irish Free State until 1922, after the Brits basically got their arses handed to them. Naturally, the newly created government of the Irish Free State wanted to use the harp as their symbol because it has several hundred years of historical value. The problem, of course, is that Guinness had already nabbed it. Rather than pick another, they just reversed it. I presume this is the origin of Janeway saying that the harp on the sign was the wrong way round, but it makes no sense on multiple levels. A little research tells me that Fairhaven is supposed to be set in the late 19th century, which is supported by Janeway giving her bartender romantic interest a 19th century college education. This would mean that the left-facing harp had no official governmental significance, as that symbol, and the government to which it was associated, didn't exist yet. And even if it had, the idea that a pub would show the government version rather than the one associated with the incredibly famous alcoholic beverage that it sells doesn't carry water either. It's possible she's referring to it as an instrument because the harp generally rests on the right shoulder of the player, so points to the left when you see the musician's face. The problem with that, of course, is that it's not always the case, and is the subject of some debate. In fact, I read a couple of articles that show traditional Irish harp playing predominantly used the left shoulder, meaning it would face the other way. It also ignores both smaller harps and when harps are played face-on to the audience. There's no official orientation for playing them. In short, Janeway's comment is complete fucking nonsense, whichever way you look at it. I'd have put that down to a simple mistake, but the doc tells us that Janeway is quite the aficionado of Irish history. If we're being generous, that might be a veiled swipe at Americans who claim to be all about their Irish ancestry, while not knowing the difference between a shamrock and a four-leaf clover, but I suspect that's me overthinking it. Oh, and while I was down the rabbit hole, I researched that Guinness poster on the wall of the pub. It's one of a series of iconic adverts by John Gilroy, and that particular one wasn't created until 1949, meaning it's completely wrong for the era in which Fairhaven is set. We can blame Paris for that, I guess, but at least he didn't claim to be an expert on the topic, so we'll let him off the hook. Onto the episode itself, and a little reading on this one suggests a lot of people don't care for it. I'm not going to suggest it's the best episode ever, or this season for that matter, and there are certainly plenty of problems with it. Gods knows Star Trek has some weird as fuck issues with how it represents the Irish, and I'm certainly not looking forward to wading through that shit when we get around to doing The Next Generation. But despite all of that, I didn't hate it. Janeway's regularly overlooked for stories that focus on her rather than what she's doing that week, and this explores a part of her psyche. Her desire to control every aspect of Mr. Punter is, on the surface, part of her natural tendency to be in charge. But by her own admission, it was partly born of fear. Maybe I just needed to be sure that he'd love me back. How much of that is from Mark back on Earth moving on with his life, I wonder? We so rarely get to see Janeway be human, let alone vulnerable, and any chance to explore that is welcome. Besides, how someone who may be spending the rest of their life on a journey deals with not being able to get involved with anyone from their crew is an interesting premise for a story. The nature of being a Starfleet captain means you always have to be aloof to a certain extent, but other captains get to go home at the end of a mission and have a personal life. Janeway doesn't get that luxury. Her struggling to find a solution for that is something she'd naturally have to deal with at some point, even if it was just to accept that it's not going to happen. We'll give a shout out to the little cough the Doc gave to prevent Kim causing Janeway embarrassment in front of multiple people. That's possibly a nod to concern for Janeway's mental health, and possibly a nod to the Doc's growth. I suspect it's probably a mixture of the two, a point to whoever thought of that. Another for the Doc giving actual good relationship advice in this one. I still remember the dogshit job he did of that for Kes back in Season 2. A little more personal experience on the matter may have helped him in this regard. Overall, I didn't come out of this one with bad feelings towards it. I can completely get why some people didn't care for the episode, as it doesn't contain very much of what we'd consider to be normal Star Trek fare. But it gives a little more data on the most seen but often least explored character of the show, and for me, that was enough. Seriously though, fuck whoever wrote that line about the harp. End of episode.
So, what about this Fairhaven place? I know I said I was against using the holodeck, but Paris already got into one bar fight there and took a couple of knocks. The guard in charge of the safeties must have thought that were funny.
Are you really sure that's a good idea?
I don't see why not. It almost did for him without our interference. Another push could see him off.
And you don't think our old friends will get involved if we use that particular program to kill him?
What old friends?
The ones in the vents.
You mean the leprechauns? Oh, bollocks. You know, now that you mention it, maybe we'll avoid anything with an Irish theme to kill him. Woof.